Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. I think to me, the two most interesting things kind of coincide with each other, right? One, Georgia absolutely dominates another opponent on Saturday and another really good opponent in Kentucky. Two, Iowa loses they're actually at home to Purdue. And so I don't think anyone necessarily thought Iowa was the second best team in college football. They were deserving of that number 2 spot. But now that Georgia has clearly established itself as number 1, I want to talk a little bit about that Kentucky game. But I also want to ask the question, who is the second best team in college football and who actually matches up best with Georgia? Now, in terms of Georgia, let me say this. You guys know about me. I don't love kind of jumping on preconceived narratives. I mean, you can argue with me about a lot of things. You can dislike me. But one thing you know, when I turn on this microphone, I believe what I say. I believe what is coming out of my mouth. And so there have been times throughout the year where there has been a narrative that I did not necessarily believe. And then there have been narratives like last week that I talked myself into even though I ultimately did not believe them. The narrative last week that I talked about on this show was everybody said coming out of the weekend where Georgia beat Arkansas and where Alabama beat Ole Miss, oh my goodness, Alabama, Georgia, definitively the two best teams in the country. I didn't believe it, but I bought into it. I convinced myself. So when Alabama lost and the conversation immediately shifted to Georgia is definitively the number 1 team in the country, I was hesitant. I was like, I know they're undefeated. They're a deserving number 1 team in the country. But are we positive? Are we positive that they are absolutely the unquestioned best team in college football? Well, let me tell you what. After Saturday, after what they did to Kentucky, after how they took care of a really good Kentucky team, I think I'm finally ready to say Georgia is unquestionably the best team in college football. And so now the question becomes who's number 2 and who matches up with them best. And first of all, when it comes to narratives, you all know if there's anybody that wants Georgia to be the definitive, unquestioned best team in college football, you already know it's me. And you know why? It's because I picked Georgia to win the national championship. How about my dogs? I love my dogs. But coming out of last weekend, even after they took care of Auburn, even after they took care of Arkansas the week before, I kept trying to sell myself that, well, you know, they're not complete. They don't really throw the ball that well. What happens if this? What happens with that? Well, I do think after the Kentucky game, I don't think it's really a debate anymore. I think the conversation is over right now, week 7, October 17th as I record here. They are the unquestioned best team in the country. And the reason why is really simple. They played another really good team, the 4th team in the top 10 that they've played, or the top 20 that they've played this season at the time that they played them, and they absolutely destroyed Kentucky. I actually thought Kentucky played Georgia harder than anybody this year, dating back to that Clemson game. And you start to look at it and you start to say, Georgia, kind of flat, kind of this, didn't play their A game. That was my takeaway when I was watching the game. I said, Georgia was really good. I don't feel like they played their A game. And then I looked at the box score. They finished with 416 yards of total offense. They held Kentucky under 250 yards of total offense. They averaged 6 yards per carry against a really good Kentucky defense. They held Kentucky's run game to 1.9 yards per rush. And I sat there and said, wait a second now. We all know what Mark Stoops did with 5 seconds left. He called a timeout to punch a touchdown into the end zone. And so it kind of hit me. If Kentucky, the second best team in the SEC East, probably one of the top 8 to 10 to 12 teams nationally, if they needed to call timeout with 5 seconds left to score a touchdown, to keep it from being a 4-possession game, there is no doubt that Georgia is the best team in the country. It's not even a debate anymore. It's not even a question. So now the question to me that becomes interesting, who is number 2 and who is going to give Georgia the most competition when they ultimately meet up with Georgia, whether it's in the SEC championship game or the college football playoff. And I do believe at this point it's hard to envision a scenario where I don't see Georgia in the college football playoff. Even if they were to somehow lose in the SEC championship game, likely to Alabama, as an undefeated or one-loss team, I believe that they would still be in the college football playoff. But the question becomes, who's number 2? How do you beat Georgia? And what I would say is, if you are looking for a saving grace, it's this. It is that I believe right now the gap between Georgia and whoever the second best team in the country is as big as it is going to be. That is not a knock on Georgia. That is not a criticism of Georgia, but it is the reality of this. Georgia is a veteran team. They bring back mostly everybody from last year. Now, they have a banged-up quarterback, but at this point, I don't know if JT Daniels is going to come back. And so until JT Daniels comes back, I can't project how good they could be with him because he never seems to be on the field. But I bring it up because of this fact. There are a lot of teams in college football that are super young that appear to be getting healthy and experienced and confident all at the same time. And so as those teams rise, I think Georgia's going to stay at this elite level, but I do think teams are going to start to rise to their level throughout the course of the season. It kind of reminds me in a lot of ways of college basketball, right? You know, you have these great teams filled with all these veterans and blah, 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 and this and that, and then you know what happens. The Kentuckys, the Dukes, the whoever in a given year, Kansas, Tennessee, Arizona, they start to get experience, they start to get confident, and then all of a sudden they might be a 2, 3, 4 seed come March, but you're like, man, I don't want Kentucky in my bracket. I don't want Kansas in my bracket because they only get better as the season goes on and they get more confident. And so when I look at who's number 2, I'll tell you this. Cincinnati's ranked number 2 in the polls. We'll get to them in a minute. I don't believe they're the second best team in the country. There's a team coming on at number 2 that I believe might be the second best team in the country, and it is a team that I absolutely crushed for about 4 or 5 weeks this season. But the one thing about me, I'm willing to pivot. I'm willing to change my opinion as we get new information. And I really like the Oklahoma Sooners. I really do. I really like Oklahoma, and let me tell you why. And if you want to criticize and you want to say, Torres, you guys in the media sell us every single year on a team like Oklahoma, then they get to the playoff, then they get destroyed by an SEC team, I can't argue with you. I know what the history says. But the history also says this. Oklahoma historically has not been good on defense. They've completely relied on their offense. And when they get to the college football playoff, they face these really dynamic offensive teams with really great defenses as well. So all of a sudden, they can't simply outscore teams like they've done in the Big 12, but they also can't stop them either. That's what happened against LSU in the playoff in 2019, that historic offense. Obviously, Joe Brady, Joe Burrow, Coach O, we just talked about them, 30 minutes ago. And then also against Alabama in 2018 when Kyler Murray went up against Tua Tagovailoa. They just didn't have enough guys, couldn't make enough stops, whatever. Well, one, I do think the defense is improved this year. Now, it's starting to regress a little bit. I'd start to be worried a little bit if I was an Oklahoma fan because they did give up a lot of yards on Saturday to TCU, and they certainly gave up a lot of yards and a lot of points to Texas. But what I would also say about Oklahoma is this. If you have not paid attention since they put Caleb Williams into the starting lineup, they are a completely different team, and I believe that they are now finally starting to hit their ceiling as a college football playoff contender and what I believe to be a national championship contender. Now, you can sit there and say, can they really win a national championship with a true freshman, Caleb Williams, under center? What I would say is Trevor Lawrence did it 3 years ago at Clemson. We've seen other freshmen step in. Tua Tagovailoa stepped into a national championship game and played well. So why can't Caleb Williams do that at Oklahoma? And oh, by the way, why can't, on top of that, Oklahoma continue to get better as the season goes on? Because I'm telling you right now, they are a completely different offense with him under center. Here is what their offense did in the 3 games before Caleb Williams took over as starting quarterback. 23 points against Nebraska, 16 points against West Virginia, 37 points against Kansas State. He took over at halftime of the Texas game. They put up 35 points in the second half. They put up 52 points against TCU on Saturday night. And by the way, that included 4 Caleb Williams. Over almost 300 yards passing in that game, 4 touchdowns, 13 yards per completion, and he also had a touchdown run of 45-plus yards. This kid's a difference maker. This kid's an X factor. We talked about Spencer Rattler on the last show. I feel bad with what his future holds. But Caleb Williams is the guy. And this offense is different with them. And I am just telling you, this team looks completely different with him in the lineup. They are going to be a completely different team. And I think they're scary going forward. What I would also say is this. I found it really interesting. Caleb Williams played the entire game on Saturday night which means that I thought that they were going to split reps with Spencer Rattler. Instead, it's the opposite. Caleb Williams is the guy going forward, and now it's just a question of how long does Spencer Rattler stay at Oklahoma before potentially leaving that school, because he is not going to regain that starting spot anytime soon. Beyond Oklahoma, who else do I believe could compete with Georgia? Because, again, to beat Georgia, and I probably should have even said this earlier, to beat Georgia, you are going to have to be able to score points and get just enough defensive stops, because Georgia's offense is elite in the run game. They have an elite defense. Can you score enough points, and can you make enough stops in the pass game? And that is something, by the way, that we still have to see from Georgia. Like I said, we have not seen them against a super explosive offense, and I do think that's going to come into play. Remember, last year, Stetson Bennett, the guy who's the starting quarterback now, he was the starting quarterback last year. Then they went up against Alabama, couldn't score enough points, went up against Florida, couldn't score enough points, and so that is something that we need to consider going forward. So who else besides Oklahoma? I think Ohio State starting to make moves in the Big Ten. Now, Ohio State's been a little bit off the radar since that Oregon win, but the thing about Ohio State is what I just said a minute ago about Oklahoma. They're starting to get better as the season goes on. Now, things are going to be difficult. They have Penn State in 2 weeks at home. And in the final 3 weeks, how about this? They have 3 teams that are all ranked in the top 25. I don't think any of us saw them coming ranked in the top 25. Final 3 weeks, they have Purdue. Yes, Purdue is ranked in the top 25 after beating Iowa. They have Michigan State, and they have Michigan. And so the Michigan game is on the road, and so Ohio State by no means has an easy schedule from here on out. I would also say they do play Nebraska. Nebraska is up and down, hot and cold, but when Nebraska is hot, Nebraska is scary. So you got 5 pretty tough games to end the season. Penn State at Nebraska, Purdue, Michigan State at Michigan. And what I would also say on top of that is even if you win, you still got to play in the Big Ten championship game. And what I would also say on top of that, your margin for error is that much smaller because you already have a loss. Oklahoma can take a bad L somewhere, still make the playoff, and compete with Georgia. Ohio State takes another L, they're probably not in the playoff. And so I bring all this up to say Ohio State, definitely there's some questions, but I think that offense is coming together nicely in a way that if they get in with Georgia, maybe they can compete with them. Last 3 games for Ohio State, 59-7 against Akron, 52-13 against Rutgers, 66-17 against Maryland. And so, yes, they're averaging 60 points over their last 3. No, they're not going to put up 60 on Georgia in a college football playoff game, but can they score enough? Can they do enough to keep up with Georgia? I think maybe they can. The final obvious team, I'll just say it, Alabama. And, I sold my Alabama stock after that game with whoever it was. Who they lose to? Texas A&M a few days ago. But what I would say about Alabama, first of all, they did what they had to do on Saturday. They go on the road, tough SEC environment, and you start to sit there and say, Alabama, how good are they? Are they really that good? Well, they looked awesome against Mississippi State. Mississippi State has a real defense. Alabama went up and down the field against them as much as they wanted to, finished with another game with over 500 yards of total offense. You look at the offensive charts now. We think back to last year with Steve Sarkisian, how great that offense was. I mean, Alabama is averaging almost 500 yards per game this season after 7 games. It's not as though this offense has taken this incredible step back without Mac Jones, Najee Harris, all that. They haven't been as productive, as efficient, but they're still a really good offense. And what I would say is the defense looked good for a single night. Now, you got to be better over the course of a season. People aren't happy with Pete Golding, the defensive coordinator, but when you look at Alabama against Mississippi State, they gave up a lot of passing yards, but it was only because Mississippi State threw the ball 55 times. Mississippi State averaged under 6 yards per completion. Alabama kept everything in front of them, and then from there also held Mississippi State to negative -1 yard rushing. So great job overall by Alabama. We'll see if they continue to get better. And the other thing that's worth noting about Alabama, a good chunk of the hard part of their schedule is done. They get Tennessee at home this week, then a bye. LSU, we don't know what we're going to get from them. New Mexico State, Arkansas, we'll see. They've been hot and cold all year. And then at Auburn to end the season. They could really be hitting a groove by the time they play Georgia in a potential SEC championship game. I'm trying to think of anybody else that I think could compete with Georgia. Listen, Cincinnati's a good story. They're fun. They play real defense. I don't think they can score on Georgia. Same with Michigan. Same with Penn State. Same with Iowa. Those are the teams, if I was Georgia, I'd be afraid of. Oklahoma, they're cruising right now. Ohio State and Alabama.